This week we're going to look at 4 ways to produce cash flow from commercial property. Like last week's video, this is taken from one of the courses within the Build It and Prosper membership community, which is incidentally free to join. It's members.builditandprosper.com, and you'll be able to subscribe to the membership community there. So you will hear me through this course mentioning in this lesson, and that's kind of what it is. So I'm going to take you right from the introduction of this course right through to the conclusion. So you'll get the full content on this video. If you are new to the channel, please remember to like and share, and also subscribe to the channel. Remember to hit that notification bell. And I hope you enjoy this week's video. And if you've got any comments, put them in the description below. Take care. In this course, we're going to talk about some of the opportunities I believe are there to produce monthly cash flow from commercial property, and why you might want to consider this as your cash flowing activity within the property industry. Now, I'll say right at the outset, I'm not an expert in this, so this is just some of my thoughts and some of the things that I've gathered over the years, and areas that I'm certainly myself interested in going into, and some of the areas I have gone into. So it's based on an observation of commercial property. I actually did have some commercial property. If you know my story, in 1983 I owned some shops. In fact, I ended up with 4 shops and a petrol station. So I owned commercial property, but that was to service that particular business as opposed to an investment. Having said that, one of the things that I found that when we sold the business, there was definitely an appreciation of that property, and that obviously helped me move on to the next phase that I moved on to, which was actually to move across and live in Florida. It had always been my dream to live in a warmer climate, and so I took that opportunity in 1991 to move myself and my family at that time, which was just 1 child, although 2 of them were then born in the States. 2 further ones, should I say. And so I was able to then move to the States, and so I saw some opportunities there, and types of businesses in the commercial environment that certainly didn't exist in the UK. Now, since then, I've started to see those types of businesses flourish. So my comments are going to be more focused on what I believe was in the American model, and perhaps, although I have no expertise in this, maybe just to get your brain thinking about various opportunities that you might not have been aware of that are available in the commercial market. Now, one of the reasons that I particularly like the commercial market is often you can get a far higher yield than you would in the residential market, sometimes doubling and tripling that yield. So that in itself is very attractive, that you put in relatively the same amount of capital then produces 2 to 3 times the result. So I don't think that can be a bad strategy. Second is a lot of the legislation that's coming down and continuing to come down in the residential market doesn't exist within the commercial market, so it's less regulated, and so I think that's a very good opportunity. Third, there is an opportunity to get into the commercial market at a lower cost proportionately to the amount of revenue that you're going to derive from there. So so that makes it also very, very attractive. And finally, I would say there's potentially a lot less hassle. You're not going to get people calling you up at midnight to say that their nappy has been stuck down the toilet, or there's a mouse on the floor and it's dead and they need somebody to pick it up, as one letting agent just told me this week. So so there's lots of I think lots of pluses why within your business profile in property you should have this cash flow element. And when we come on to the course on lowering your risk, I talk about that you need 2 areas of income. You need one area that produces cash flow, and a second area that gives you chunks of money so that you're then able to buy down your debt and therefore lower your risk. But I won't say too much more about that because, as I say, that's in the course, Lower Your Risk. So you will come to that when you study that course. So let's get started now on the first model that we're going to look at within the commercial cash flow. In this short lesson, I want to talk fundamentally about the decision of whether you should build or whether you should buy an existing property for whatever you're doing within the commercial environment. Now, that will depend on which particular strategy you're interested in, and we'll talk a little bit more as I go through those strategies. But generally, a building that is already in existence is going to be a lot cheaper. And often the reason that that is on the market is, or perhaps not even on the market, but you've identified it as a potential to purchase, is because the building, for whatever function it was, has now ceased to be the case. So that could be, for instance, a factory unit which that company is no longer in business, or they've perhaps shifted their production area to somewhere else, or they don't need as much space anymore, so they're located to a smaller size factory. So for whatever reason, that particular use has probably become redundant. And particularly if it's been on the market for a long time, the chances are that it's no longer fit for purpose, and therefore that's going to depreciate the value of that asset to someone, and so therefore it needs some sort of change of use in order to bring that back into life. Whereas with a new build, you're going to have to, of course, first of all, source the land, and then you're going to have to build the actual fabric. It's going to be bang up to date, it's going to be shiny new, and certainly probably fit for purpose because you're going to build it for purpose, but it generally is going to be a lot more expensive, often by a factor of several times, somewhere maybe between 3 and 5 times the price, depending on what it is. In fact, I do know of situations where a friend of mine a number of years ago, at the sort of like 2012-13 sort of era, purchased an old factory which he managed to buy at 1/3 of the original asking price, and able to turn that into a multi-let of for different purposes of storage units for different businesses, as opposed to the consumer storage area, and so much so that that's almost going to yield 100% by the time that he's completed all the conversions on that. So generally, buying existing properties is going to be much more economical than building new ones. Just taking a few seconds out of the video just to remind you, if you haven't already subscribed to this channel, to subscribe and to hit that notification bell. Now back to the rest of the course. You have to have been living under a rock to not realize that the retail sector is really struggling, and has been for quite a number of years, as many of the traditional lines and products that were available through retail shops have moved online, and the COVID-19 has only exacerbated that particular trend. There will always be a need for retail shops, but they will be a niched need, I believe. I think there's probably some exciting ways that retail shops can be redeveloped, particularly the high street. But there's still going to be a huge overcapacity even with those innovative ideas. And I was reading something recently, they were talking about maybe creating retail high streets as more of an entertainment area, so introducing things that traditionally we would not have thought to be in retail high streets. But one of the big difficulties with the retail high streets and shopping centres is that they traditionally are owned by pension companies, and they have a certain value on them, and to convert them to something else, perhaps the most obvious seems residential, is going to mean that they're going to take a huge hit onto the balance sheets of their accounts, and that clearly has an effect on the pension funds if it's a particular pension fund that they are involved in. So there is something there that needs to be resolved, and it may be government intervention of some sort of compensation. I really don't know what the way forward is for that, but it's not that people aren't thinking about these things, because they clearly are. It's just how you actually move forward and resolve them. However, within retail, there are certainly some opportunities. Now, about a year and a half ago, I purchased a small bakery shop in a very much a secondary location. In fact, it was in a small village, and it was on the market for 35,000, and it had been a bakery shop, as I said before. Clearly there was not enough demand, and when you actually look at this particular area, there's probably 5 or 6 vacant shops there. So and the other ones all still remain on the market a year and a half later, and probably have been on the market much longer than that. However, I saw this particular shop, and I wanted it for my own personal use to create an office, and I found it also had a basement in it, so I thought I could maybe use some of that space. And so that currently is going through a process of building warrants, because I was having some difficulty about putting stairs down into the basement, and that has now been resolved, but took some time to resolve. In fact, it's taken about a year to resolve. So for me, that's quite an easy one, because I'm going to use it as my own space. However, there is the opportunity within that, and one of the things and this is one of the things I'm exploring, is to create some hot desking opportunities where I would rent out a couple of the desks. So if I take, just give you an illustration, it's actually a small unit, and principally there is on the ground floor area, it's shaped a bit like this. This being the sort of like the back shop area. This space is actually narrower than that. So this is basically a break room. The stairs are going to go down here, and there's the opportunity to create some desks, and I reckon that we can at least get 4 desks in there. Probably could get 5, but except the door's there, so that might be quite drafty. But in order to do that, so we would then create these as perhaps hot desks. I would be using one, and perhaps my office manager would be using the second. Also, there's an opportunity to create some space downstairs, so I might relinquish that and use the space downstairs. So, but there's an opportunity to perhaps let out 2 or 3, and as I continue to expand, I'll probably find that I outgrow this space, but that would give me the capacity to bring in at least 3 further members of my team, and use that space. And then when I outgrow it, I can then just turn it entirely over to a let for each of the hot desking, and and perhaps even at some point sell it on with people in place, because I would have actually increased the value of this. And these would probably typically rent out for about £300 a month, all in. And so even with that, even if I only rented out 2 of them, that's £600 a month, which is more than going to cover the cost of the facility. So I have a net situation where I'm actually not costing anything to run my office. So that would be quite an interesting concept. And what did I pay for it? Well, I actually paid in the end, through some negotiation, £18,000. And primarily that's because there weren't many, there really was nobody else looking at it. Nobody else had any sort of vision for it. If this doesn't work, it really doesn't matter, because as I say, it's an office for myself. So in that respect, there's no risk to me doing that. But other retail units could perhaps go for residential conversion, depending on what the area is. This was certainly not desirable for residential conversion, and so you just have to think about what is an alternative use perhaps for that property. Although I have to say I'm less interested in shops. I think it's one of the less interesting areas of commercial property. In this lesson, I want to talk about office accommodation. As I said in my introduction, I moved to Florida in 1991, and at that time I immediately had a need for an office, and I moved into this shared office space. And it's the first time I had really come across this concept. And essentially what it was it was a larger building, and they had actually taken over a couple of the floors, and they had subdivided it into individual offices. But what was interesting to me, particularly at that time, was that they had a reception area. So they had communal areas there, and you were able to walk into that reception area. And while it didn't advertise your particular business behind the reception desk, the receptionists were very well trained there, and they operated as if it was your business. And so therefore they were able to direct them to your office if it was somebody coming in, or if indeed they called you on the phone, you had your own line, and which they were able to patch through to your office, so you didn't actually have to do the connection yourself. It was all part of the service, and they would answer it in your company's name, and then they would put them through to you, and they would say, I'd have such and such, Mr. or Mrs. Brown on the phone for you, and they would put it through to you. It sounded very, very professional, made you seem like a much larger company, particularly if you were a single operator. Then it seemed that that you had a real presence there. But also, they also allowed those services to be available even if you didn't have an office there. So they had a service where they would answer your phones. They could provide also secretarial services for you. So this was particularly in the time before the internet and before emails. So I often had letters that needed to be sent out. I would give them a draft of the letter, and they would type it up on my note paper, and it would go out to my client or potential client, or whoever it was it needed to go out to. So again, created a very professional environment. And another concept would be what we talked about in the previous lesson, where you provide some hot desking facility. So you could provide space for people. Let's assume you had maybe 10 spaces. You could actually sell that on a sort of license basis, where they have the ability to come in and use that space, but it's probably for people who don't need a space all the time. So they maybe need a couple of hours 2 or 3 times a week, and therefore because of that you can actually increase the capacity of the number of people that would serve. So perhaps a series of 10 desks might service up to 40 people, because they're not going to need them all at the same time. Now, I don't really know the logistics of that. As I said, I'm not an expert in these areas, but this is just to give you some food for thought. But the whole thing about using this sort of model, as opposed to just taking the traditional model, which is to have a office block and you rent out the space on a leased basis, is that it gives you, again, much more flexibility to change with changing trends, but also lowers your risk, because at any one time you're not relying on one particular tenant or one particular licensee. You're dealing with maybe a certain amount of occupancy. If you think of it like a hotel very rarely has 100% capacity, so they base their room rates on a certain capacity level, and so that might be, say, 70% occupancy. So if they have 100% occupancy, that's great, because that's extra profit, but there will be times where maybe they only have 50% occupancy, or maybe even in dire times far less than that. So but on balance they'll average out about 70%. So your cost would be, or your basis would be on whatever your average occupancy rate is. If you have a single let, then of course that occupancy is reliant on one particular tenant. Now, of course, they may be tied into a long lease, but then what happens if something happens to that business and they go into liquidation? Then it doesn't really matter that you've got a lease for, say, 25 years. You're still not going to be able to collect on it if they've gone into liquidation. So it does create a higher risk. And generally, the returns on those sort of deals are much less than you can have in if you apply a multi-let situation. And in this lesson, we're going to talk about storage, and in particular self-storage. Now, this is a trend that I saw again when I was in the US, and I particularly like that concept. When I moved back to the UK in 2000, I didn't see an awful lot of evidence of it. It is an industry that has started to grow up, but we are still very much at under capacity, and so there's a lot of scope for development in this area. But one of the things that I haven't seen here in the UK, and of course I haven't tried and tested it whether you could actually get planning for this, but I thought it was a very interesting concept. And what they did was that they would have generally a purpose-built area, and let's just take it as an oblong here. And what they would do is they would have storage units that were around the outside, and these were often single units that you could basically probably had a roller shutter on that you could get into. So they had these areas here all the way down, often for larger items. Sometimes people would actually store cars and the like in there, or boats. Maybe not quite so much call for that here, but these were generally larger units, and they were of varying sizes. And then they would have perhaps a building in the middle here, and this was actually several stories high, so they had lifts in there, obviously a larger capital investment, and then they'd have lots of different size units in there that you were able to store. But what made this particularly different was, I kind of liked it, and I've probably put this in the wrong place, was that they actually had here a residential unit, and this was actually the manager's accommodation. And so the service desk would be somewhere in here. This is not a particularly good drawing, as you'll take it. But the rest of this accommodation would be for them living in, and then they'd have an office area which they would service clients from. It would have an automatic gate there, and so people still had 24-hour access. But you had the added security of having somebody on site at all times, and they would then look after new customers moving in, moving out. They would look after the maintenance, because you had somebody on site looking after the maintenance of it. And perhaps a husband and wife team might work very well, because she might be very good at administration and he might be a handyman, so he might be very good at the maintenance. And it seemed to be a concept that worked very well, and very much would mean that you are just overseeing this as opposed to having to manage it yourself. So you would actually have your own people managing it, and you would basically oversee it, taking away from you the day-to-day activities of managing it. And I think that works out as a very profitable business model. Now, in this country, one of the things that you can do to even get started into self-storage is to get a piece of industrial land and put storage containers on there. These are often the types that are used for shipping goods around the world. They're often used on construction sites to store materials. I use them on construction sites to store materials. And you can rent those out on a monthly basis. So you'd have an area again of the industrial land. You would basically put the units, have a fence around there, and you would have a series of these blocks, perhaps creating a U shape. You might have an entrance here, and you'd have some sort of maybe gate security. So again, people could have 24-hour access. The units themselves, you could probably buy them for between 1,000 and 2,000 a piece. But the beauty of this model is that you could start off with just very few units, maybe 2 or 3, rent them out, and then as you continue to expand, you can buy additional units, and so therefore you gradually fill up the space until you've got all the units pretty much let out. So it means that you can start with a much lower investment, and you can have some cash flow coming in before you're committing to the purchase of further capital expenditure. So again, I think that's quite an interesting model. And the other thing, which I think is probably an even better way to do this, if you can, is to perhaps, let's say you purchase an old factory building where you're going to put in some storage and you're going to maybe turn this into perhaps an office area. And then what you do is that you've got some space here, some of it's going to be for car parking, but maybe that you have also some storage units there, so that you're actually testing the market here, and you're therefore getting some income from your storage units, you're getting some income from your office accommodation. So I think that could be quite an interesting model as well. And one further thing is that you could actually buy perhaps even a factory unit. And one of the things that I've seen being done, which I thought was really interesting, was using aluminium construction, so as that within this, so if this was a completely open space, that you're able to create these little units using aluminium construction, and I'll show you some pictures of that. And again, building this the units as your capacity increases. Now the beauty of all of this is it doesn't take a lot of labor in order to service it, so it's not labor intensive, and therefore it pushes your yield up and makes it a very good cash flowing type of business model. And so the areas that I'm really interested in are the serviced office accommodation, the storage units, self-storage units, and also the ones in the next lesson, which we're going to talk about, is in small industrial units. So again, this concept comes from the US, or my time living in the US, and it's small industrial units. And so what I saw there was that you had a block of industrial units, and they would basically be for people, perhaps joiners, plumbers who needed somewhere to work, or maybe small light manufacturing. And so these were broken up into typically about 1,000 square feet in area. And so you'd have these industrial units, but also what was kind of neat was that each of them would have on there an office space. So they had a place where they could administer the business and talk to clients, so that would have an entrance there, but then there'd be like a roller shutter which would give them access to this space here. At that particular time, these were generally renting for about $400 a month. You've got to remember that's almost 30 years ago now, so they're considerably, probably at least double that, I would think. Somewhere between 8,000 and 1,000 per month, and that's in dollars, obviously. In the UK market, I really don't know what these would rent for, but I think this would be quite an interesting concept. And again, perhaps a use for maybe a disused factory that was of this space, and you might actually have them on either side. So you might find that there's 1,000, these are 1,000 square feet, obviously then proportionally that would be smaller, and then you might have them over this side here, so you might have 8 to 10 units, again producing a much better yield than you could just by letting out the factory space as it stood. So in this course we've talked about some different models to produce a monthly cash flow, with all with the idea of being a lower risk and producing a higher yield than is achievable through residential letting. So it's something I hope you will have a look at. But as I said, I'm no expert in this area, and if it interests you at all and would like to pursue it further, then get in touch with me and I will point you in the direction of some resources and some people who have been in this industry far longer than I have and have a much deeper knowledge and can really help crystallize some of the things that you might be thinking of doing and help and assist you on that journey. Well, I hope you found that useful. Next week, we're going to be talking about residential development opportunities. In other words, how you start to create chunks of money. Just a reminder, if you haven't already subscribed, please subscribe and hit that notification bell and like and share this video. Until the next week, I hope you stay safe and have a great week. Take care. Bye-bye. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more videos. Then click to watch the next video. Please remember to visit our website at builditandprosper.com, Together app, or click on the button on the YouTube header if you're on desktop.